Hey everyone, welcome aboard from both Sci-Sphere and the Beautiful Chaos. For today's deep dive, we're tackling some research with a headline that really made us stop and think.
It definitely grabbed our attention.
Intelligence is a whole brain phenomenon. New research challenges old theories.
It's a bold claim for sure.
It really is.
And it's based on some very interesting work that was published in the December 2024 issue of PMAS Nexus. So
Wow.
we've got that article along with some other related pieces and some expert analysis to kind of help us break it all down.
I think this is one of those times where the headline makes you go, wait, what? Like, we all know intelligence is a thing, but did we have it wrong this whole time?
Well, it might not be as easy as just right or wrong, but this research definitely challenges some of the traditional thinking about intelligence.
Right.
But before we get into that, let's just make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we say the word intelligence.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
It's a word everyone uses, but it can mean like a million different things
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
to different people.
So in this context, we're talking about kind of those general cognitive abilities
Okay.
that allow us to learn and to reason and to problem solve.
Okay.
And generally, that's been broken down into fluid intelligence, which is your ability to think on your feet and adapt to new situations.
Right.
And crystallized intelligence, which is all that knowledge that you build up over time.
So, okay, if I'm trying to figure out like a tricky puzzle, that's fluid intelligence.
Yeah.
But knowing all the state capitals, that's crystallized intelligence.
Exactly, yeah. And both of those contribute to what we call general intelligence.
Okay.
Now, this new research that's come out of Julius Maximilians Universität, Würzburg, JMU for short.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, I know, right?
Pretty good here.
Suggests that instead of intelligence being tied to specific areas of the brain, it might actually be more about how well all those different parts of the brain communicate with each other.
So it's less about having a smart part of the brain and more about how well the whole network is connected.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, so they took fMRI data from over 800 people in the Human Connectome Project, and they looked at brain activity both at rest and while people were doing different tasks.
Wow, 800 people. That's a lot of brain.
I know, right? A lot of data.
What do they see in all that data?
Well, so their key finding was that the strongest predictor of someone's intelligence wasn't activity in a specific brain region.
Okay.
It was actually the strength and the distribution of connections across the entire brain.
Well,
And what was even more surprising was that the sheer number of connections was
okay.
even more important than which specific regions were actually connected.
Hold on. Are you saying it doesn't matter which parts of my brain are talking to each other as long as like lots of them are chatting away? That seems counterintuitive.
I know, right? Like, what?
It kind of is, and it really challenges a lot of that traditional thinking that focuses on, specific areas like the prefrontal cortex, for example,
Right.
being like the main drivers of intelligence.
So this research is pushing us towards a more complex, more holistic view.
So are we talking about like a total paradigm shift in how we understand intelligence?
Well, it's definitely a big step in that direction.
Okay.
And, to make sense of all that data, the researchers had to rely on some pretty sophisticated tools.
Yeah, I was wondering how they crunched all that.
Right. So specifically, they were using machine learning techniques.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I figured they must have been using something like that because that's a massive amount of information to go through.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So they used this technique called layer-wise relevance propagation.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah. So it's a way to really pinpoint which of those connections are the most relevant when you're trying to predict intelligence.
Okay, break it down for us non-neuroscientists.
Okay. So imagine you're baking a cake, right?
Okay.
And you've got like 100 different ingredients.
Okay.
And you want to figure out which ingredients are the absolute essentials for that delicious cakey flavor. Right. Layer-wise relevance propagation is kind of like that, but for brain connections, right? So it sifts through all that data and it pinpoints the connections that are really crucial for actually predicting someone's intelligence.
Okay, I like that analogy much better.
Yeah.
So what did they find?
Well, one of the most interesting things that they found
Yeah.
was that fluid and general intelligence
Okay.
were best predicted from brain connectivity during tasks that were cognitively demanding, so like things that involve language processing.
Okay.
On the other hand, crystallized intelligence was linked to connectivity patterns that showed up across a bunch of different tasks, even at rest.
So my brain working on a crossword puzzle says more about my fluid intelligence than when I'm just like vegging out on the couch.
That's what the research is suggesting, yeah.
Wow, okay.
And it gets even more interesting when you consider how the brain is actually organized.
Okay.
And they talk about this idea of modular organization.
Modular organization. What does that even mean in the context of the brain?
So think of it this way. Your brain isn't just like a random jumble of neurons, right? Firing all over the place.
Yeah.
It's organized into these specialized networks or modules, and each one handles different processes.
So like different departments in a company, each with their own like area of expertise.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And some of these modules were especially predictive of intelligence, like the default mode network,
Okay.
which is active when you're kind of daydreaming or reflecting.
Right.
The frontoparietal control network, which is involved in planning and decision making. And then, the attention networks, which
Yeah.
are super important for, well,
Yeah,
focusing.
So different modules for different tasks. That makes sense.
Right.
It's like a well-organized office with each team focusing on what they do best.
Exactly.
Okay, but how does this all tie back to intelligence? Like, are some modules more intelligent than others?
Not necessarily.
No.
What's interesting is that this research and a 2017 study that they cite suggest that the efficiency within certain modules might be key. So, for example, the 2017 study found that people with more efficient hubs within their salience network, which is part of the attention network, had higher general intelligence.
Hold on. Hubs within the salience network. Can we unpack that a little?
Sure, yeah. So think of it like this, right? The salience network is responsible for helping us focus our attention on what's important,
Okay.
right? So it filters out all the distractions and it kind of highlights what we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah.
And within that network, there are these central points or these hubs that are responsible for coordinating that information flow.
Got it.
Yeah.
So if those hubs are working efficiently, we're better at filtering out the irrelevant information
Exactly.
and focusing on what matters.
Yep. And that ability to focus, to prioritize that relevant information seems to be a big part of intelligence.
So it's not just about having lots of connections, but it's also about having the right connections in the right places and being able to manage that information flow efficiently.
Yes.
This is getting complex.
It is complex,
Yeah.
and that's why this research is so groundbreaking.
Okay.
It's really pushing us to think about intelligence in terms of these two key factors.
Yeah.
Integration,
Okay.
which is that efficient communication between those different modules,
Okay.
and then segregation, which is the ability of each module to kind of shield itself from all that irrelevant information so it can really focus on its own special function.
So integration is like having those open lines of communication between departments,
Yeah,
and segregation is making sure that each department can work independently when they need to.
exactly.
Got it.
Right, and this study found evidence that both of those processes are playing a role in intelligence.
So it's that delicate balance between integration and segregation that lets our brains function at their best.
That seems to be the case.
Wow,
Good.
it's fascinating, right?
This is mind-blowing stuff. What stood out to you most from this research?
I think for me, it was the way that this study was able to use machine learning to make sense of this really, really complex system.
Yeah, it really shows just how powerful these tools are for unlocking new understandings of the brain.
Yeah, it's incredible that they could figure out those most relevant connections just by analyzing brain scans.
I know.
That's amazing, but what does all this actually mean? Like, why should anyone care about, brain connectivity and modules when it comes to something as complex as intelligence?
That's a great question and one we'll dive into right after.
Actually, let's hold that thought for a second.
Oh, okay.
I think our listeners could use a minute to kind of let all this sink in before we jump into the implications.
You're right. We have covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in. So
Yeah.
we'll pick up right where we left off in part 2.
Stay with us.
So before we pause, you were asking why anyone should actually care about this research.
Right. It's fascinating. But what are the practical implications of all this?
Well, think about it this way. What if understanding these brain connections could help us actually improve cognitive abilities?
Okay, now that would be amazing. Are we talking like boosting IQ scores?
It's not quite that straightforward, but this research definitely opens up some pretty exciting possibilities.
Okay.
If intelligence really does depend on these brain-wide connections,
Yeah.
could we potentially strengthen those connections through targeted interventions?
It's like a workout for the brain.
Exactly, like a brain workout.
Sign me up.
Right. It's a cool idea.
Yeah.
And some researchers think that cognitive exercises, things like brain training games or learning new skills, could actually lead to changes in brain connectivity.
That makes sense, right? Like if you're constantly challenging your brain, those connections are going to get stronger.
That's the idea, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the mental exercises either.
Oh, okay.
There's also more and more evidence that lifestyle factors, things like exercise and sleep and diet,
Right.
can really have an impact on brain health and
Yeah.
potentially, influence connectivity as well.
So all that stuff our moms told us about eating our vegetables and getting enough sleep,
Right.
it actually makes us smarter.
Well, it's not like a guaranteed path to, becoming a genius or anything.
Right.
But the connection between a healthy body and a healthy mind is becoming more and more clear.
Okay.
And this study, while it wasn't directly testing those interventions, it gives us a framework for understanding how those interventions might work on a neurological level.
Okay. So we're not saying that we can all become Einstein just by, doing Sudoku and getting 8 hours of sleep.
Right. Not quite.
But this research is suggesting that maybe we have more control over our cognitive abilities than we thought.
Exactly. Yeah, it might not be as simple as, popping a pill to boost your IQ.
Right.
But understanding these connections could help us come up with better strategies for improving cognitive function.
I'm picturing like a personalized brain training program
Yeah.
based on your individual connectivity patterns,
Yeah.
It's like a fitness tracker, but for your brain.
I love that analogy. And honestly, it's not as far out there as it sounds.
Okay.
I mean, there are already companies developing, brain-computer interfaces and neurofeedback systems that aim to, not just monitor, but even influence brain activity.
Whoa, that sounds straight out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah,
But it also brings up some ethical questions.
it does, yeah.
Like what if someone tries to use those technologies to, enhance intelligence beyond,
Right, beyond what's normal.
what we consider normal?
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Those are really important things to think about.
Yeah.
As with any powerful technology, there are potential risks and benefits, and we have to be really careful and think about them.
Right.
But, I mean, the potential for good is just huge, right? Imagine if we could help people with cognitive impairments.
Right.
Or even just, help boost everyone's learning and problem-solving abilities.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty amazing.
I think that's a topic that deserves its own deep dive, honestly.
Definitely.
But getting back to this study, they also talked about intelligence being a global property of the whole brain.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
So remember how we were talking about those different types of intelligence?
Right.
Fluid, crystallized in general?
Yeah.
So they found that general intelligence, that kind of overall cognitive ability,
Okay.
had the strongest predictive power when they were looking at overall brain connectivity,
Okay.
which kind of suggests that general intelligence isn't tied to any one specific region.
Yeah.
It's a product of the whole brain working together.
It's like a symphony orchestra, where the overall sound is more important than any individual instrument.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Each instrument contributes, but it's the interplay of all of them together that creates that beautiful music.
Yeah.
And in our brains, it's that complex network of connections across all those different modules
Yeah.
that gives rise to all of our cognitive abilities.
This research also mentioned that fluid intelligence seemed to be more dependent on task-specific connectivity, while crystallized intelligence was linked to those connectivity patterns across different tasks, even at rest.
Right.
What's going on there?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It suggests that those different types of intelligence actually rely on different patterns of brain connectivity.
Okay.
So the connections that are activated when you're, actively engaged in a challenging task, like, I don't know, solving a puzzle or something.
Right.
Those are more relevant to your ability to, think on your feet and adapt.
Okay.
But those connections that are consistently there, even when you're relaxed,
Yeah.
are more indicative of, your accumulated knowledge and skills.
So the brain is constantly forming and reforming connections, both during activity and at rest. And those patterns of connectivity are what seem to underlie our different cognitive strengths.
Exactly. That's a great summary.
Wow, it makes you wonder about all those times we think we're doing nothing. Like when we're daydreaming or just spacing out, maybe our brains are actually working hard behind the scenes,
Yeah.
strengthening connections, consolidating information.
It's definitely possible, yeah.
It's amazing to think how much we still don't know about something as, fundamental as intelligence.
I know.
This study is groundbreaking, but it's obviously not the final word on the matter.
For sure.
So what are some of the big questions that still need to be answered?
Well, for one, we need to understand how these connections change over time.
Okay.
Like, Do they get stronger with learning and experience? Can we intentionally modify them? And what about the role of, genetics and environment?
Right, like nature versus nurture, but for brain connectivity.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, so this study was focused on the relationship between brain connectivity and intelligence, but it didn't really look into what causes those differences in connectivity.
Right.
And that's a whole other area of research that we really need to explore.
It's mind-boggling to think about all the factors that could be influencing how our brains are wired.
It is.
Yeah, but also really exciting.
It is. It is exciting.
If we can figure this all out, it could completely change how we understand intelligence and how we can nurture it.
Absolutely, yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, will we be able to look at a brain scan someday and say, okay, here are your strengths and weaknesses, and here's a personalized plan to help you reach your full cognitive potential?
That would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
It's a really compelling vision.
it is.
But before we get too carried away thinking about the future,
Right.
let's bring it back to the present.
Yeah.
What's your biggest takeaway from all this?
I think for me, it's just realizing that intelligence isn't just about being smart in that traditional sense.
Yeah.
It's about those intricate connections and that communication that's happening all across the brain and how well all those different modules work together.
I completely agree.
Yeah,
It really changes our perspective on what it means to be intelligent.
absolutely. It's not just about having a big brain. It's about that amazing symphony of activity that's happening inside our heads every second.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
And this is really just the beginning.
Yeah.
There's so much more that we need to learn about the brain's incredible complexity
Right.
and its role in shaping who we are.
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain is definitely buzzing after all that.
Mine too.
Yeah.
And I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about too.
For sure.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
there's one more fascinating aspect of this research
Okay.
that I think we need to explore.
Oh, you mean like how even when they removed connections from an entire network, it didn't really affect the model's ability to predict intelligence?
Exactly. That just blew my mind.
It's pretty wild, isn't it?
It is.
It really emphasizes that intelligence is not localized
Right.
to any specific region.
Yeah.
It seems to emerge from this complex interplay of activity across the entire brain.
It's like the brain has this incredible ability to compensate even when like a whole network is missing.
Yeah.
It just shows how resilient and adaptable our brains really are.
It really does.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But let's save that conversation for part 3.
Sounds good.
Hang tight, everyone. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. We were just talking about how this study really showed us that intelligence isn't just confined to one spot in the brain.
Yeah, it really changes how we think about a smart part of the brain.
Yeah.
Even when they took out connections from a whole network in their models, they were still able to predict intelligence really accurately.
That's the part that really got me. It's like the brain has this backup system
Yeah.
to make sure that intelligence emerges no matter what.
It's pretty amazing.
It really speaks to the resilience and plasticity of the brain. It's incredible.
It is. It really challenges us to think differently about intelligence,
Yeah.
Move away from this idea that it's like a fixed trait and more towards something that is dynamic and adaptable.
It's like saying that instead of a solo virtuoso, intelligence is more like a jazz ensemble.
Ooh, I like that.
Even if one instrument drops out, the music keeps going, it adapts, it evolves.
That's a great analogy, and it raises a really interesting question. If intelligence is this adaptable,
Yeah.
if it's this resilient, could we be doing more to nurture it?
You mean beyond like the brain training games and the healthy habits we talked about?
Exactly. Yeah. What if instead of focusing on drilling these very specific skills, we focused on things that promote that brain-wide connectivity?
Yeah.
What if we could create learning environments that encourage lots of diverse connections
Yeah.
and train the brain to get better at integrating and segregating information?
It's like we've been trying to train these star soloists when we should be focusing on building a symphony orchestra,
Yes.
right? Teaching the brain to play together, to harmonize, instead of just focusing on the individual parts.
That is such a good way to put it.
Right.
It really highlights how we need a more holistic approach to education and cognitive training.
I'm already thinking about how I can apply this to my own life.
Right.
Maybe less time on social media,
Yeah.
more time doing things that challenge my brain in different ways.
Absolutely. This research gives us so many new and exciting paths to explore.
It really does.
It's like we've just seen this whole new landscape,
Yeah.
and we can't wait to see what's out there.
I don't know about you, but I'm walking away from this deep dive with just a totally new appreciation for how complex and amazing the human brain is.
Me too. It reminds us that we are all capable of really incredible things.
Yeah.
And we're really just starting to understand what our minds can do.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this incredible journey into the world of intelligence.
It's been a great conversation.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing.